Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. My topic today is, the topic that was chosen was the Quran and the perennial philosophy. And Dr. Nasser, of course, introduced the topic of the perennial philosophy so well this morning that some of what I was planning on talking about I can dispense with, which I'm very happy about. And what I'm going to try to do is to speak a little bit more as opposed to what one might say the bird's eye view of the relationship between the religions and Islam, as it were, to try to maybe land on the ground and see what's going on at the boundary between Islam and other religions, and specifically how some of the arguments are deployed in both directions regarding the question of inclusivism, exclusivism, universality, and so forth. It has been half a year since the study Quran was published, a book which you see is on sale outside. And an aspect of this work which has attracted considerable attention from some quarters is the matter of its relationship with the perennial philosophy, or as it has most commonly been used by our critics and others, perennialism. This is a notable moment in intellectual history in which the world's foremost representative of the traditionalist school, traditionalism of course being another rough synonym for perennial philosophy, Sayyid Hussein Nasr, has led an effort to produce a major work on the Quran and the vast intellectual tradition that has made sense of it for Muslims through the centuries. Now, rather than give a generalized account of perennialism and the manner in which the Quran talks about ultimate truth and also other religions, I would like to explore some concrete questions that have arisen as a result of the public encounter between we Muslims who believe in the idea of a perennial philosophy and those Muslims who have found in the study Quran an objectionable and even heterodox feature they label perennialism or have labeled it a perennialist work and so forth. In the time we have today, it would be impossible to survey the relevant passages of the Quran, Hadith, and the Islamic theological, legal, and spiritual tradition, and I am certainly not claiming to say the final word on it today. However, it is worthwhile to explore some of the parameters of this question in order to understand what the debates actually are and what they are not. Related to the perennial philosophy, which as Dr. Nasser discussed earlier, are some other terms which maybe are not out of place to mention, like philosophia perennis, perennial wisdom, religio perennis, the transcendent unity of religions. But for my purposes today, especially these words traditionalism or simply tradition, which Dr. Nasser highlighted in his opening remarks. And as he also mentioned, the idea of the Sanatana Dharma in Hinduism, Deen al-Fitra, or the Deen of the Hanifs in Islam. The term perennialism, with the ism at the end, as an idea related to religion is actually of relatively late provenance, and in English is more commonly a term for a certain approach toward education and the use of long-standing ideas and classical works. The pitfall of a term like perennialism, much like the lamentable but now unavoidable translation of tasawwuf as Sufism, is that it calls to mind the various ideologies that have driven modernism forward in its contradictory directions for the last few centuries, and it renders it, at least on the surface, into an ideology among ideologies such as communism, fascism, liberalism, conservatism, and so forth, but we'll have to leave this difficulty aside for now. Now, all people accept certain perennial truths, realities which all people everywhere and in all times know. Sense perception is the same for all human beings. The rules of everyday deductive logic are the same. Our basic impulses and faculties are the same. To put it simply, one could say that there is a certain, that is now coming to the perennial philosophy, one could say that there is a certain common metaphysics throughout the religious traditions of the world, meaning that there is an essential unanimity to answering questions such as, what is the world like and what does it consist of? What is a human being? Where have we come from and where are we going? What is the good? And from these follow answers to questions such as, how should we live and what is the best kind of society? I said essential unanimity because the differences between traditions on fundamental questions are real, meaningful, and at one level irreducible. Perhaps what distinguishes what I would call traditionalist perennialism is that this essential or transcendent unity is not only real, but is also providential. And just as important, the differences are also, in a very real sense, providential as well. That is to say, there is a transcendent unity of religions because God willed it to be so. That much perhaps is relatively easy to grasp. But according to this view, the religious differences are also willed by God, which might be more difficult to grasp initially. Now, broadly speaking, there are two directions from which opposition to the perennial philosophy, or what I would call traditionalist perennialisms, originate. One is academic and modern, and objects to the idea that there is any experience or knowledge that is not mediated by concepts, ideas, culture, class, and the whole range of reasons why human beings never experience or think about the thing in itself, but are mired in various sorts of externally determined subjectivities. In one form or another, according to this view, human beings are trapped in their conditions and cannot see outside of them. In short, it is an argument based on relativism, whether Kantian or postmodern or some other form. The other kind of objection comes not from relativists who object to the notion of objective truth, but from exclusivists who see any version of the perennial philosophy itself as a form of relativism that denies the truth claims of any particular tradition. That is to say, the exclusivists object that if all truth claims are true, then none of them are really true. This exclusivist objection is not based, of course, on a denial of human objectivity, since it relies explicitly on truth claims having real meaning. Rather, a religious exclusivist denies the existence in other traditions of some crucial reality or attribute, whether that is salvation or guidance or illumination or realization. The exclusivist objection to perennialism is generally predicated on the idea that it is through the correct metaphysical commitments that we human beings can fulfill our ultimate purpose. And since other traditions have different metaphysical commitments, or so it would seem, they cannot reach the same goal and they cannot be the same and have a unity. What is paradoxical, however, is that within the exclusivist objection, there is what one might call a hidden relativizing tendency. This tendency is not to assert that objectivity is impossible, but rather to reduce truth to the purely formal and outward articulation of truth claims. One type of exclusivist argument against perennialism is that since the different traditions make mutually exclusive truth claims, for example, the Christian Trinity and Islamic Tawheed, if one asserts that these are really just pointing to some hidden truth, one is robbing the religions of their right and their ability to tell the truth about anything. The result, they claim, is that one elevates the person who finds that hidden truth to the rank of absolute and ultimate arbiter of reality and truth. And one is thus imposing meaning and distorting each religion by trying to make them say the same thing, and thereby making them say nothing in particular, and hence to say nothing really at all. However, this line of argument relativizes or limits truth in its own way, because it assumes that metaphysical truth is and can only be captured by concepts. It reduces the words of revelation to their definition in the dictionary. It makes scriptural symbols into pure technical concepts, into the elements of a proof. It renders the mythic and the poetic into a kind of dogmatic algebra. Just as the relativist makes truth a function of extrinsic conditions, the maximalist exclusivist, in his way, makes truth a function of a series of discrete definitions that gives the truth finite boundaries. And to do this goes directly against the teachings of all the world's traditions. Each religion, every religion, teaches that the truth is inexhaustible. The Quran, for example, speaks of the oceans of ink and the forests of pens that would not be able to write out all the words of God. And the sages and the saints, as a rule, speak of silence and ineffability in relation to the absolute. The Tao that cannot be named has its equivalent in all traditions. All people know that most of our everyday common human experience is not and cannot be put into words, including and perhaps especially the most important and foundational truths. And let us never forget that even what is commonly an extremely uncompromising form of exclusivism, that is to say Asharite theology in Islam, resorts to paradox to speak about the nature of God when they uphold the doctrine that divine attributes are neither different from nor identical with the divine essence. Which is to say, the reason I'm using that example is that when it comes to sacred things, and especially ultimate questions, logic, and this is widely acknowledged, is not necessarily violated, but can be recognized as being inadequate, thus resulting in expressions of paradox and symbolism rather than logical analysis. When such paradoxes are embedded in a larger intellectual life of truth and symbols, of morality and beauty, they are not seen as violations of reason or as philosophical luxuries, but as profoundly necessary genuflections in the face of ultimate reality. What I mean is, as evidenced by the rather universal reliance on paradox, even by exclusivists, even within those traditions, not every apparent contradiction, such as those we see between religions, is necessarily a nullification of truth on one or both sides. The Asharite doesn't conclude that since the divine attributes are neither different from nor identical with the divine essence, that they must necessarily be nothing, or a series of empty words, as mere logic would demand. The attitude that recognizes the limits of human language to describe metaphysical truths does not deny that truths aren't true, you might say, at their own level. But it does assert that the truth is not exhausted by that level. The Quran is the book in which there is no doubt. It's practically the first line of the Quran. And yet it also speaks of the inexhaustibility of the divine truth. The Quran is true, and it also opens onto the truth. In this connection, it is thus important to note, or I should say it is also important to note, that when one speaks of this ineffability or of divine silence or spiritual silence, this is not necessarily a quote-unquote mystical experience of the kind that was taxonomized by scholars like William James and many others. As Houston Smith points out, quote, like mystical theophanies, metaphysical intuitions are ineffable, unquote. He quotes Frithjof Schuon, who says, the core of the perennial philosophy is doctrines. Smith continues and notes that, quote, the doctrines derive from metaphysical intuitions, and it is to these that perennial philosophy appeals. To discern the truth of a metaphysical axiom, one need not have an experience, quote unquote. I note this, I'm mentioning this because it is common to hear that the basis for the transcendent unity of religions or the perennial philosophy is this thing called mysticism, when in fact the anchor, the core, is metaphysics, without at all denying the commonalities of extraordinary human states, sometimes called mystical experiences. Both metaphysics and experiences are ultimately ineffable. So what is the difference? I'll quote Smith again. He says, experiences bring into more or less direct view features of higher ontological orders. This does not happen in metaphysical discernment. There is not, when it comes to metaphysical discernment, there are not other ontological realms, but principles that pervade all that come into view, end quote. There are still, and one could go on for a long time, there are still other misunderstandings and possible misunderstandings of why people like us call ourselves traditionalists and perennialists. And let me say clearly, the perennial philosophy or traditionalist perennialism is not a vague notion of pluralism, nor is it a reluctance to discern truth from error, nor is it a socially charitable attitude towards other people's beliefs. It's not a plea for tolerance, and it's not a social program. It is not a false humility of not wanting to claim to know the truth. It is not a nervousness about stating that some people deserve hell for rejecting God. It is not a coping mechanism for dealing with conflict. While traditional perennialism may lead to positive outcomes and illuminate these areas of concern, that is not its foundation. Traditional perennialism is not like other philosophies that could also loosely be described as perennialist or pluralist, which conceive of human wisdom as the product of human reason and experience, and which state that human beings throughout history have strived to acquire the truth, and that those who have succeeded have found the same reality, and who go on to say that we should focus on that common and mutually intelligible core, the overlap, you might say, the common denominator. But that's not our view. Ours is a definite idea of how sacred history has proceeded, not merely a mental construct by which people are allowed to express their faith in different ways. Our belief in the truth, guidance, and wisdom of other traditions stems from our recognition of their divine origin, and in a belief, based upon the fruits of that tradition, one might say, that the wisdom, virtue, and sacred presence has been sufficiently preserved, cultivated, and transmitted by the human beings of that tradition, such that it still functions in a way that can make it a path to God, in a way that polytheism and idolatry cannot, in a way that Scientology cannot, right? It's not just a kind of vague idea of pluralism. Now, I also want to say a couple of words about the definition of religion. This was introduced by Dr. Nasser this morning, and I'd like to expand upon it. And part of the problem of understanding the nature of the perennial philosophy is a common and generalized, typical, impoverished understanding of religion. Often in modern life, in modern intellectual life in general, religions are conceived of in the wrong way from the outset, reducing them to a list of propositions on the one hand and a set of obligations on the other, full stop. One believes in these things and one does these other things. Religion surely consists of both of these and would not be religion without them. But to reduce the traditions of the world to these two elements is to consciously or unconsciously make religion into a substitute for modern scientism and related ideologies. This creates problems for the understanding of perennialism in particular, but it leads to many other misunderstandings on the topic of religion overall. Indeed, a religion is not simply a list of propositions and actions. It is also a presence, a sacred presence. It would be impossible for Islam to survive 1400 years, produce saintly people, works of great beauty and profundity, and an absence of ugliness, without this blessing and power as a part of it. We believe in the angels. Sometimes people forget about that element of the 6 articles of faith. We're not deists who see the world as a giant clockwork machine with God standing outside of it. The angelic and spiritual realm is an essential aspect of what makes a religion comprehensible as a phenomenon and allows it to survive from generation to generation. A tradition does not survive only on the power of its ideas, on the cleverness of its original design, but is sustained by the souls and the institutions that receive and transmit blessings and power through the generations. If Islam is what it is, not only because of the teachings, but also because of the barakah of the Prophet, and the barakah of the Quran, and the way in which the angelic and spiritual world is made to protect and guide Muslims by God's will, then this situation must have also been true for the other previous religions. They were not only a set of beliefs and actions that people carry out in life, which are then printed out like a receipt in the hereafter. Rather, God listens to prayers. He sends the angels to perform tasks of guidance and misguidance. He illuminates the hearts of human beings. He enables wisdom and vision to be actualized in human hearts, in human beings who are loyal followers of these traditions. I will return to this question in a moment. Now I want to say a few words about what the Quran actually says about other religions. And as I said before, time simply does not allow me to examine the dozens of passages that are relevant to the understanding of the Quran's view of other faiths and other traditions, and especially the two that it speaks most about, Judaism and Christianity. A good place for readers to start is the essay by Joseph Lombard on the subject in the Study Quran, and also the book by Reza Shah Kazemi, The Other in the Light of the One. And I've also written a small, humble paper entitled The Muslim View of Christian Prayer, which discusses some of these passages in detail. But what I would like to say is that the picture of other religions that the Quran paints is, and I think everyone has to accept this at a minimum, complex and nuanced. Those who are seeking a clear-cut exclusivism, or on the one hand, or an easygoing, anything-goes universalism on the other, will be stopped in their tracks by any comprehensive reading of all the passages in the Quran on these subjects. Plucking one or two out in isolation simply won't do. The Quran levels rather harsh critiques at times against Jews and Christians, but it also praises and affirms them. In one passage, it condemns priests for amassing wealth, and in another, praises monks for humility and prayer. In one place, it balks at the Trinity, and in another, calls Christians the nearest to Muslims in love and affection. If we Muslims take the criticisms of the Christians seriously, as we do, we cannot then ignore the praise of Christians either. We cannot claim, I would say, that all the good things said about the people of the book in the Quran are in the past tense, while all the bad things said about them in the Quran are in the present tense. On what consistent basis are we allowed to do this? Rather, we must find a way of looking at the world and at the revelation, to look at both what is critical and praiseworthy, such that our understanding of the text and our understanding of the world do not contradict one another, and that they cohere, that they're coherent with one another. And as I said, I think a comprehensive reading will lead to the following conclusion, which if I can state briefly, that the Quran teaches that the faiths of Christianity and Judaism are what you might say flawed but sufficient vehicles that enable believers to reach God. I know this is somewhat of a daring way to say it, but I think it does justice to the subject. That is to say, Christianity allows, for example, a person to know God sufficiently well from the Quranic or the Islamic point of view, and to act and worship such that one becomes the kind of human being God wants us to be. Now, this does not mean that the errors and excesses that the Quran mentions aren't actually errors and excesses. It means we have to understand what those are, of course. But what it does mean is that the religion as a whole, when it's speaking about Christianity or Judaism, as a tradition not only of doctrines and obligations, but also a living community and a set of institutions existing in history of wisdom and beauty, remains a saving vehicle, a way that God accepts without necessarily endorsing every last institution, teaching, and human being in it. Even at the individual level, speaking subjectively, God accepts our imperfect understanding and practice because it is a certain type of soul that God wants, not a flawless treatise on creedal matters. No human being is a perfect actualization of the creed and of the law, but God does accept a sufficiently good soul. Do any of us, is anyone in any religion, can they say that they truly understand all the points of creed as they should be understood, and that they truly carry out the rituals of religion as they should be carried out? Don't we always fall short? Now, just because a human being accepts an allegedly perfect list of beliefs doesn't mean that they've actualized it. A religion is more than that. The relationship between a human being and a religion is more than that. Now, I want to emphasize, on the other hand, that this does not mean that the articulations of faith and truth are not important. It doesn't mean that they are relative. It does not mean that the law is not important. Not at all. Speaking personally, practically my whole waking life is devoted to the refinement and exactitude in doctrine and to the principle that bad beliefs lead to bad actions and bad outcomes. However, that does not contradict the principle that a tradition can be good enough and sufficient, one might say, to get a person to reach the truth. There are traditions that cannot really be reliable to allow a person to reach the truth, like the polytheists of Arabia. God may save a Scientologist, but not through Scientology. Now let me move on to another question related to this, and that is the role of Islam as a religion at this point in history and its relationship with perennial wisdom in particular. We traditional perennialists insist on orthodoxy, which means we cannot mix religions with one another, since we would thus be placing ourselves in the place of a prophet. God forbid. Now, can we, at this point in history, insist on this orthodoxy while claiming that our authority for the transcendent unity of religions comes solely from human understanding, however that understanding is conceived? No, rather we must have some kind of warrant from heaven. God could not remain silent on such a matter as perennialism or the transcendent unity of religions, not at this moment in history. And in fact, we do find this warrant in the Quran, and we must be faithful to it, and also be constrained by it as a truth of sacred origin. In my view, Islam has a providential role at this moment in history as the last religion, as a synthesis that contains all the possibilities for realization that are present in the other world religions. It is in fact closest to its origin and in many ways more pristine and closer to its ideal state. It is the Quran that gives human beings an explicit way to think of other traditions, to judge them, to reject them, to praise them, and to criticize them. It is perhaps possible in other traditions to subscribe to the perennial philosophy, but to do so without explicit warrant, and often with great personal difficulty. Indeed, the Quran speaks of itself as a confirmation, and it calls itself a guardian of the previous revelations. It calls upon us to believe in what was sent down before and to the Prophet Muhammad. This is of the greatest significance, and we can never forget it. And as Dr. Nasser said to me in a conversation, Islam serves the function of being an anchor, of being an anchor for the other traditions. And I dare say, without the barakah of the Quran and the Prophet, at least in the long term, there would be no home for the perennial philosophy in our world, no ground for it to grow and thrive. It is no accident, to my mind, that most of the major exponents of the perennial philosophy, not all, were and are Muslim. There are non-Muslim perennialists, to be sure, but they have had to contend with traditions that don't really give a house for them to live in, to use, again, the metaphor of living in a home. I would also claim, by the way, that this idea of the transcendent unity of religions does not relativize Islam. This was a point I made earlier. And in fact, you could argue that it elevates Islam and shows another way in which the mission of Muhammad ﷺ was a mercy to all the worlds and not only to some. This is in fact an important line of argument that's developed by Reza Shah Kazemi in his book. More broadly, I have come to think that Muslims as a whole, Islam as a whole, serves this purpose, or serves the purpose of bearing witness to ultimate truth in the world today, of being shaheed ala nas, as the Quran says, being a witness for mankind. I cannot expand too much on this point, but I just want to share that in my experience, one cannot discount the significance for some people who aren't Muslim of the radiation of the Quranic and the Muhammadan barakah. We shouldn't trivialize the possibility of a person in this world having their primordial covenant with God remembered and awakened by Islam and by exposure to the sacred, and clinging to a faith in God despite the world conspiring to destroy any such faith. Muslims should not too quickly dispense with the idea that a non-Muslim seeing a Muslim and absorbing lessons from his practice or experiencing the Islamic civilizational ambiance, which is really an extension of the Sunnah of the Prophet, otherwise it wouldn't exist. We shouldn't discount that that person would take that wisdom and use it to progress toward God in the framework of their own faith. This has happened many times, and it does no good to simply reflexively say that there is no good in this. Such an experience for that non-Muslim might constitute neither a rejection nor an acceptance of Islam, but would be an encounter that is meaningful in its own way between that person and God. I have to admit I would say this is a subtle area that I cannot develop here, but I wanted to allude to it at least in the context of these remarks. Let me now turn to some of the concrete claims of Muslim exclusivists. Now, I don't want to oversimplify things. There are different kinds of universalism and exclusivism in the Islamic context, and it would be a mistake to create a kind of a binary or to just put them into two categories. But I do want to talk about a certain set of critiques of the traditionalist position that I would like to use to explore some of the difficulties in holding, within the Islamic context, to a rigidly exclusivist position. Some of the detractors of traditionalism in general, and the study Quran in particular, have voiced a view that says that in Islam, there is what is called a consensus view from which we have diverged. Now, consensus or ijma' is not like the English word consensus, meaning a kind of a majority view, but it refers to a unanimous affirmation on the part of authorities without dissent. And so to invoke ijma' or consensus in the Islamic context is to invoke a kind of absolute authority that cannot be opposed or even overturned, and not even by a later consensus. Now, our detractors do not cite a consensus in some merely generalized sense that perennialists are wrong or that approving of other religions is bad. It's not a vague notion at all, but a very concrete idea that we are accused of being guilty of kufr for diverging from, or being disbelievers for, or being guilty at least of some disbelief for diverging from. And this consensus view that they're claiming is the following. Every living Jew and Christian, if they do not embrace Islam before they die, stand condemned. There is no excuse that allows them to say that God has no argument against them. I want to emphasize, no Christian or Jew has an argument, or hujjah as it's sometimes framed, before God for not embracing Islam. Not a single one. Man, woman, doesn't matter. One authority often cited in this context, and I would argue misquoted, is Nawawi, who's actually quoting from an earlier scholar, Qadi Iyad, and I want to read this quote for you. Quote, "Someone who does not believe that whoever follows another religion than Islam is an unbeliever, like Christians, or has doubts about declaring them to be unbelievers, or considers their way to be correct, is himself kafir, unbeliever, even if with that he professes Islam and believes in it." Unquote. Now, this passage from which Nawawi is quoting, written by Qadi Iyad, who's a Maliki jurist in Spain, rejects any position which might entertain the possibility that any extenuating circumstance might exist for non-Muslims in this situation. The claim is there is a consensus, again, a unanimous consensus, that you must believe as a Muslim that every living non-Muslim is a kafir, and failure to do so with complete certainty means that you are a kafir. This is the view that they're invoking consensus about. Now, if this truly were a consensus view, what do we make of the scholar Al-Ghazali, the great Ghazali who died in 1111, who in his famous work Faisal al-Tafriqa argues that what he calls the Christians of Byzantium and the Turks, who were still outside the Islamic world at that time for the most part, would come under what he calls God's mercy, to come under God's mercy. This is a phrase that is very significant. The argument goes, those who know the teachings and virtues of the Prophet and yet still deny him deserve to be called disbelievers. That's not surprising. But he gives wide latitude in recognizing the obstacles to this knowledge. How could a Turk who had never heard of Muhammad be faulted? Moreover, why should a person who grows up hearing that the Prophet Muhammad was the great liar investigate his truth claims, since no one would expect the same from a Muslim who hears of someone accused of being a false prophet? Hearing the name Muhammad means nothing if one learns only the opposite of his true attributes. One could extend this reasoning to point out that one is unlikely to deem a religion good or desire to learn about it if the only followers one meets are bad. Such mitigating circumstances, which Ghazali alludes to, namely that birthplace, upbringing, and social experience mediate one's knowledge of religion, provide ample space from within the Islamic perspective, within the Islamic world, for God's mercy to encompass those who believe in him and in the hereafter and act righteously. And here, I don't want to get too technical, but it's crucial to note that the passage that Qadi Iyad, in this passage of this kind of double takfir, this reflexive takfir, of declaring someone to be an unbeliever if they don't declare the right people to be unbelievers, explicitly entertains and rejects the argument of Ghazali and claims it as consensus. It characterizes that position as kufr, actually. By the way, Qadi Iyad also ordered that the Ihya Ulumuddin of Imam Ghazali be burnt, which I think is the real reason why people quote Nawawi instead of Qadi Iyad. But that's a second question. To me, it's rather implausible, to say the least, that Ghazali, of all people, would be in violation of a consensus. Wouldn't he have known about it? It's a view from late in his life, and there's no evidence that he backed away from it. So it's far more likely that there's really no consensus in the first place, and it is just a view that is claimed to be the object of consensus, and that's happened many times in Islamic history, and it continues to happen today. You just have to watch YouTube videos. Everything is consensus, 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 consensus. I want to explore, having said that, this idea of rejection, because it actually raises interesting issues that are logical issues and also historical issues. A key element of what is said to make non-Muslims be condemned, according to this exclusivist view, is of course the rejection of the Prophet or the rejection of Islam. But what does it mean today to reject Islam? Personally, I don't think it's really reasonable to compare an Arab who knew Muhammad ﷺ personally, who was in the presence of his barakah and his conduct, who heard the miracle of the Quran in his own vernacular, who gazed into the face of the Prophet and his companions, and to compare that person to someone whose knowledge of Islam comes from a shabbily dressed, heavily accented person screaming at them that their parents' religion is stupid and their culture is sick, and whose knowledge of Muhammad is that he was just one of many people who make religious claims and who should be judged by their fruits, meaning people who practice Islam today. Why should we, living now, elevate ourselves and think that the rejection of the Prophet himself personally, as the Quran speaks about, in his living presence is the same as the rejection of our often mediocre example? In fact, I would argue that this world, our world, has reached such a point that the notion that people can be expected to, as a matter of course, find the truth of a religion in a way other than through God's grace is just not reality. The world is mad. People cannot judge the truth of a tradition simply based on its inner logic, as these texts might suggest. And certainly the modern psyche is not such that it can be called upon to make a spot decision and turn on a dime. In a less chaotic and simpler spiritual landscape, it would be common for people to be exposed to the truth and just embrace it, like a rider checking his horse and changing direction. But the modern mind isn't that way. Almost no one we know is like that. The modern soul is like a loose collection of objects floating in an ocean, ideas, beliefs, experiences, images, memories, and it takes time to turn all those around and head them in a new direction. It's a complex process and mostly hidden from the outside world, and even to the person in whom the transformation is taking place. Rejection, this idea that you find in this polemic, should also be understood, therefore, in light of psychological sophistication and with a great deal of subtlety. So coming back to Ghazali, he speaks of various categories. He speaks of, number one, people who have never heard of Islam. Number two, people who had heard of the true Islam and rejected it. The third is people who had heard of Islam but a deformed version. And then this interesting fourth category, sincere seekers who were investigating Islam. This fourth category did not necessarily have to die as Muslims, but they died in a state of sincere truth-seeking. As Muhammad Hassan Khalil, who has done a lot of scholarship on this subject recently, writes, quote, "Among the reached by the message of Islam, conversion to Islam is not the only path to salvation. Also salvific is the sincere willingness to investigate the truth claims of Islamic revelation. It is for God to determine whether the truth seeker should arrive at the whole truth in this life." Now, speaking from within this perspective of Ghazali, can we really have a firm and fair definition of what it means for a message to reach a person, for that message to be made comprehensible? I'm a professor. I teach students who not only haven't read the Quran, but because of the conditions of modernity, cannot read the Quran. They don't have the equipment. People cannot even understand religion enough to reject it very often. Any religion. My students are Catholics. They can't even read the Bible. That's not me speaking. That's my Catholic Jesuit colleagues speaking of their experience. At this time in history, when awareness of other faiths is greatest, paradoxically, our collective ability to decipher the symbolism and meaning of those faiths, in the general population at least, is at its weakest. This is very important because one argument that's made in this exclusivist polemic is that if some people are not born Muslim, they nevertheless are obligated to search out and investigate the truth. And in this era, this notion of what in Arabic is sometimes called wujub an-nadhr, the duty to inquire, should be considered carefully. There are simply too many truth claims to investigate in this world, if you think about it from the starting point of an ordinary person. To know all the world's religions well enough to judge them according to this criterion is physically impossible. It cannot be done, never mind whether it should be done. If one is answerable for investigating the truth claims of Muhammad, how is one supposed to know that his claims are the ones to be investigated first? A logical person might investigate in chronological order, with the oldest religions first, beginning, let's say, with Native Americans, and then Hinduism, then Taoism, Buddhism, Zoroastrianism, and then only after a long time come to Islam, but likely expend one's life before even getting there. What if one never gets to it? And besides, who is the rare person that could even contemplate such an enterprise today? We are in God's hands, we truly are, and it is impossible to impose a general duty to investigate that holds as a kind of rule for all human beings. William Chittick writes, quote, "In pre-modern times, discussions of religious differences like those that can be undertaken today were impossible. The great authorities of the past did not have what we would now take for granted, access to peers and other religions, and a wealth of books and information. Pre-modern scholars interpreted what little they knew about other religions in terms of the absolute truth of their own religious command. Practically no one had the means or the interest to look at the actual teachings of other religions or to learn about them by talking with their qualified representatives," unquote. It would have seemed plausible, perhaps, to a Muslim scholar of the 12th century that a person could realistically investigate, according to this doctrine of wujub an-nadhr, the duty to inquire, the various known truth claims. But in fact, the world's truth claims are so numerous and each one so vast, profound, and requiring the mastery of new languages to understand, not only human languages, but languages of symbolism, that the so-called duty to inquire is essentially unrealistic if one means by it a rational evaluation of all options. If, however, one means by it the duty to seek the absolute, to understand the good, to act on what one knows, then of course this is something that every human being is obligated to do. This is a way to understand, I argue, Ghazali's fourth category of these sincere truth seekers. For him, it was a sincere seeker after Islam who hadn't completed his journey. But wouldn't what Ghazali said apply to a sincere truth seeker today, a person who truly was devoted to the truth, but had not yet reached it, no matter where he happened to be? I want to turn now to another technical concept. I promise there won't be too many more of these, called the concept of abrogation. Another crucial idea in Muslims' view of other religions is the notion of abrogation or naskh. Many people know that within Islamic law, abrogation refers to the repeal and replacement of one religious ruling with another. For example, a majority opinion holds that the act of changing the Qibla from Jerusalem to Mecca was an instance of abrogation. But it's also said within Islamic theology, somewhat later it has to be said, that Islam abrogates, using that same language, all the religious laws before it. The question for us, though, is what is being abrogated? What is being repealed? And what does this abrogation actually mean for a religion's ability to guide a person to God, or to be, for a lack of a better term, a valid religion? How can this notion of abrogation be coherent? I'd like to use, if you permit me, a thought experiment to explore this question. Imagine that a companion of the Prophet during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, left on a journey and was shipwrecked on an island before the Qibla was changed from Jerusalem to Mecca. He continues to pray towards Jerusalem and lives the rest of his life like that. In a sense, his practice is abrogated. But does God not accept the companion's prayer because he continues to pray that way? I think most people would say that that prayer is accepted. Most Muslims, I should say. Now, what if a known enemy of the Prophet sailed by and from a distance shouted to that companion that the Qibla had been changed? Why would he believe him? Would he investigate that claim? He'd be justified to ignore him and keep to his own Qibla. He would be like that person in Ghazali's example who heard about the truth but from someone he deemed to be unreliable or to be a liar. But here's a key point about that stranded, shipwrecked companion. He would not be saved only because of God's mercy, that term from Ghazali. The idea that God's mercy is vast or that he would be excused. That is because Islam leaves capacious room for God's mercy, in a kind of a negative reason. Rather, he would be saved because his prayer would be positively valid. It would be through that prayer that he would, in a sense, be accepted. It would be a means by which he worships God and God accepts it. Allahu A'lam. This is a way in which, at least from within this perspective of abrogation, one can conceive of two faiths being simultaneously valid at the same time. Indeed, the doctrine of Islam abrogating previous religions only works if those religions were valid in the first place. A part of the definition of abrogation in Islamic legal theory is that the abrogated command would remain effectual but for the existence of the abrogating command. That's uncontroversial. So, if a Christian today faithfully practices Christianity, looking at it from the Islamic point of view, how is he different from the shipwrecked companion who is innocently praying toward the wrong Qibla? If Christianity was valid before the Prophet Muhammad, in what way does it become invalid after him? If it was never acceptable, then what is the Quran confirming or affirming on so many occasions, as it says so many, many times? Moreover, why would it be abrogated as opposed to simply being falsehood that's overcome by truth, which is how the Quran speaks about polytheism and atheism? And you also have to ask, who is addressed in regard to abrogation? If you think about Judaism, if it's the Jews, then they don't accept the authority to abrogate their laws by Islam in the first place, so abrogation means nothing. If it's Muslims, they already accept the total authority of the Quran, so abrogation again means essentially or effectively nothing. While there were some discussions in Islamic legal history about whether the laws of previous revelations could still be in effect, that's not really the matter that's at hand here. Moreover, what about Christians who lived and died during the lifetime of the Prophet Muhammad but died before Islam ever reached them? Does their relationship with God change because some foreigner uttered the words, Muhammad, the last prophet? Does God stop listening to their prayers at that moment? Does the wisdom fly out of their hearts? Do the angels disappear? I think these are all serious questions. One more point. Soteriology, or that is to say the question of what happens in the afterlife, is really not the only question here. Yes, we know that the akhirah, the hereafter, is greater than the dunya, than this world, and that the one is eternal and the other is fleeting. But the Quran talks about guidance and light in this world and the next. It speaks of the great good of wisdom. We have to account for the presence of real guidance and wisdom in these other traditions. Do they simply evaporate worldwide at the moment another prophet is sent? Do the wisdom and truth in the heart of a sage suddenly, unbeknownst to its possessor, become folly and error without any discernible change in his outer conditions? This is not a trivial question. My last example comes from Ibn al-Arabi, who is often cited for his views on other religions. And I'm quoting, this is from the Futuhat al-Makkiyah, quote, "All the revealed religions, shara'a, plural of sharia, are lights. Among these religions, the revealed religion of Muhammad is like the light of the sun amongst the light of the stars. When the sun appears, the light of the stars are hidden, and their lights are included in the light of the sun. Their being hidden is like the abrogation of other revealed religions that takes place through Muhammad's revealed religion. Nevertheless, they do in fact exist, just as the existence of the light of the stars is real or actualized. This explains why we have been required in our all-inclusive religion," he's speaking of course from within Islam, "to have faith in the truth of all messengers and all the revealed religions. They are not rendered null or false." The Arabic word is batil, which can mean many things. "They are not rendered batil by abrogation. That is the opinion of the ignorant. All paths return to look to the Prophet's path, alayhi salatu wasalam. If the messengers had been alive in his time, they would have followed him just as their religions have followed his religion, for he was given the all-comprehensive words, jawami' al-kalim." Unquote. About this passage, Reza Shah Kazemi says, quote, "For Ibn Arabi, the fact that one's own religious law sustains the traveler upon the path does not signify that other laws are intrinsically incapable of sustaining other communities in their spiritual journey. Even if all other religions are deemed to be eminently comprised within Islam, seen as the final all-comprehensive way," unquote. And he also says in another article, quote, "To believe that pre-Quranic religions lose their efficacy is thus to render meaningless the avowed function of Islam to be a confirmation and protection in relation to other religions, to those religions. If the religions are inefficacious as vehicles of salvation, there is no point in confirming and protecting them. They should simply be cast into the dustbin of religious history along with other degenerate religious traditions, according to the logic of those who believe that abrogation equals nullification, the ignorant, as Ibn Arabi calls them," unquote. T.J. Winter, also known as Abdul Hakim Murad, who teaches at Cambridge, directly takes on the idea that Ibn Arabi can be used to justify the perennialist view. He points out that Ibn Arabi severely critiques Christian doctrine such as the Incarnation, thus undercutting any such reading of Ibn Arabi. I should note that he also says, quote, "Even were a pluralist reading of some passages in Ibn Arabi deemed allowable, these would amount to no more than a moment in his playful discourse in which opposite premises which briefly appear amidst limitless determinations forever collide," unquote. Maybe, maybe not. In any case, the argument that Ibn Arabi heavily critiqued Christian doctrines is not the checkmate Winter or others might deem it to be. Frithjof Schuon, the author of The Transcendent Unity of Religions, has written many pages of rather pointed and profound critiques of Christian doctrines and institutions such as the Trinity, the papacy, the Mother of God formulation, the Filioque, just to name a few. One could quote in isolation pages of Schuon to someone who was unfamiliar with his body of work, and they might conclude that Schuon was an exclusivist. But thinkers must be judged in accordance with their general metaphysics and everything relevant that they've written or said on a particular subject. What I mean is it's very difficult to turn Ibn Arabi into a strict abrogationist and exclusivist if we take his entire body of work into view. If one objects in similar fashion that Jalaluddin Rumi, who is also cited in support of perennialism, said this or that negative thing about Christianity and that Christians converted to Islam at his hands, which is true, then the same can be said for Schuon, who had led many people into Islam and who, moreover, has extended critiques of all manner of Christian theology and civilization. The challenge for us is to make sense out of the whole and not to extract parts for our own purposes. Let me conclude. There is no doubt that the traditionalist perennialism I've discussed here will not be fully accepted by most Muslims. That is not to say that most Muslims are the kind of exclusivists who would agree with the sentiment of at least the way that they're framed, Qadi Iyad or Ibn Hazm, who I didn't have a chance to talk about, but neither would they be full-throated supporters of our position. This is natural, and indeed, we should not feel at all aggrieved by this. It's to be expected, and it's normal. However, I want to state categorically that I reject the idea that what we say about other religions goes against Islam or is contrary to the Quran or the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. Some have even claimed that our view goes against what is ma'alum min ad-din bid-darura, which can be translated as necessarily known religious doctrine, things which you cannot not know as a Muslim. Where in the early creeds is the doctrine that believing in the validity of Jews and Christians' practice is itself disbelief? Where is it in the Fiqh al-Akbar of Abu Hanifa? Where is it in the creed of Imam al-Tahawi? Where are these early statements corresponding to the reflexive takfir of an-Nawawi? In fact, what we traditionalist perennialists do from within the Islamic traditional point of view is to bring out what Ghazali left unsaid in speaking of some non-Muslims falling within that very general and capacious idea of the mercy of God, which leaves the manner in which God saves other people unspoken. What traditionalist perennialism represents within Islam, within the Islamic tradition, is the unfolding or the elaboration of a truth that was kept implicit, or to use Islamic terminology, that which was mujmal, which is now being made mufassal, right? A process of tafsil. So much of Islamic thought is precisely the result of this kind of process of unfolding. What we are saying is not alien to the Islamic tradition in itself at all. I do not accept that there is binding consensus that explicitly opposes what we claim, nor do I accept that it goes against some necessarily known matter. Not every claim of consensus actually is a consensus. And I'll ask again, was Ghazali going against a known consensus? Nor do we accept, as some who criticize us say, that what we are saying is brand new, and no one has ever uttered a word like it before the 20th century. These accusations are simply factually incorrect. If those who disagree with us want to do so, that is fine, that is normal, that's acceptable. But it cannot be on the basis of accusing us of falling into disbelief or, God forbid, apostasy. If we were wrong, or if we are wrong or incorrect, it is a matter of what the Islamic tradition calls ta'wil, or interpretation. I would direct people to the position of Hamza Yusuf, who openly disavows perennialism, by the way, but restricts this disagreement to the domain of ta'wil. Just read his account of his meetings with Martin Lings, Sheikh Abu Bakr Siraj ad-Din, and his appreciation of Lings while disagreeing with Lings on the matter of other religions. One may accuse us, as Muslims, of having erred due to a faulty interpretation of passages of the Quran, but that is the maximum accusation that any Muslim can fairly level against us. As I said at the outset, this is not a comprehensive accounting of all the relevant issues involved, but I hope I have contributed something useful to the understanding, to the conversation about the place of perennial philosophy in Islam and the role of Islam at this point in history. Thank you very much.